Trump really believed, and his advisors, who are not prepared to talk crosswise to him at all, were, bucking him up. That, Mr. President, you're so brilliant and you're so strong, and if you just show the Chinese how tough you are, they will knuckle under. They will do anything you want because their economy is not performing well, and they can't handle a fight from the Americans. And it turned out that was really badly wrong.
Hi, welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. I'm James Heapy, and this week we are joined by Ian Bremmer, a political scientist and academic and commentator who has a habit of being incredibly astute in his commentary of the Trump administration. So who better to have on the show after another week in which American foreign policy appears to be shaping events globally. Ian, welcome. Can we start, please, with the end of the period when tariffs were supposed to be imposed on us all and a stay of execution has happened, other than for the Canadians? What's going on?
Trump has not had the success that he clearly had hoped for on the trade front. I'm sure you've seen all of the announcements, particularly from the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who loves being on TV, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, that there are going to be lots and lots of deals signed imminently, all of these inbound conversations. Everyone can't wait to agree with the Americans. And of course, here we are in July, and there are two framework agreements in place, one with your great nation, the United Kingdom, another with Vietnam, which is not a tiny country, but not the most strategically important for the United States, and that's it. And there are a lot of negotiations going on, and there are a bunch that are close. India is a meaningful one. I actually think Canada's closer than people think, but certainly what there really is an enormous amount of uncertainty still in July. There is a Trump that is both frustrated that he hasn't gotten his way, but also very confident that the markets aren't punishing him for taking whacks at other countries, and is continuing to ratchet up not just his rhetoric, but expectations for baseline tariffs. Perhaps the most meaningful statement that came from Trump this week was in saying he expects the baseline for all countries that don't come to full agreement with the Americans to be 15 to 20%. And that's a lot higher than the markets have been pricing in, and it's a lot higher than American tariffs have been for nearly a century. So this is a very, very different environment, and Trump is convinced that tariffs are a very important tool for American foreign policy, industrial policy, and soft power.
Now, his foreign policy priority is obvious: America first, and you it is reported, coined the phrase from a Trump perspective, at least. It just strikes me that the lack of appreciation in the administration of what harm that does to America's cause is pretty extraordinary. This certainty that trading with America is so essential for so many nations that the tariffs will be paid, or a deal that favours America will be done. Is there a moment when the Senate steps in and says, enough's enough, this is too damaging, let's get back to something slightly more, slightly less competitive?
So the place where I think I agree most with your sentiment, or the way you framed that, is on US-China relations. Here, Trump really believed, and his advisors, who are not prepared to talk crosswise to him at all, were, bucking him up. That, Mr. President, you're so brilliant and you're so strong, and if you just show the Chinese how tough you are, they will knuckle under. They will do anything you want because their economy is not performing well, and they can't handle a fight from the Americans. And it turned out that was really badly wrong. It was badly wrong because the Chinese are prepared to be patient, more patient than the Americans, and also because the Chinese have tools that they can use that can hurt the Americans economically, particularly on the restrictions of licensing of critical minerals that have the capacity to cripple significant pieces of American industry in red states, by the way. And Trump really did not appreciate that. And so that's why Trump has blinked repeatedly, not just in taking off the tariffs that he had put on the Chinese that essentially amounted to a boycott, but even, and this hasn't gotten the headlines, he's even actually eased some of the export controls on semiconductors, specifically on design, which was an absolute no-touch area for Trump and for Biden over the past years. And now they're talking about when Xi and Trump might be able to meet in person for a summit. It looks to me like that's going to happen quite plausibly in Beijing in the early fall. So there's no question. This is a very important trade partner. It's the second most powerful economy in the world, and the United States has backed off dramatically from where the U.S. had been. I don't think that that is equivalent to what's happening with other countries around the world. You have some countries that are desperate for a deal with the Americans and have been really trying to find any way to give the Americans something that Trump will be happy with. The Japanese are in that position. For example, it's not a tiny economy at all. Many of the Southeast Asians are in that position. Central American countries are in that position. Mexico is certainly in that position. And Europe is a question mark, because while the EU is the world's largest common market and has trade competency at the highest levels, Europe also desperately needs the United States on security, defense, and intelligence matters, and they don't want to undermine that. And so they've been treading very carefully not to escalate with the United States. Now, I understand that the answer I just gave you is nuanced and it's not a great headline, but I mean, sometimes reality is like that. And what's nice about being on your show is we have the time to actually not just sort of spout a tweet at people.
Well, that is what we try to do. I've got to be honest, I've just come back from Washington this morning, having been there for 3-4 days and catching up with various friends in the Senate. The House was all on recess because they got all of their one big beautiful bill work done so promptly. And I was struck as ever, just the everybody who, or most of the people, I think, in the House and the Senate are actually very bright, well-informed, internationalist people. And yet, this stuff, the precariousness of global trade just seems to not be on their radar. And the sort of this sword of Damocles that is hung over the world through the kind of will he, won't he tariff moment just doesn't really seem to worry people. The only thing that people say is that if he gets this wrong, and if instead of it being the sword of Damocles, it genuinely starts to move cost of living pressures in the US, then it becomes incredibly politically potent. And at that point, Congress steps in, because various senators have told me that this is ultimately a competence of the Senate, not the executive. Is that right?
I guess I have a slightly different view, but let me on the broad scheme. On the narrow question, it is congressional competence, and there are lawsuits making their way through the courts, most importantly in the response to Trump's ability to use IEEPA, which is this specific national security emergency sort of ability of the president to impose tariffs that he's used against everyone, even against Brazil, which has nothing to do with a national security emergency. It's not even a country that the Americans are running a deficit. They run a surplus, and Trump just doesn't like the fact that they're treating Bolsonaro, his buddy, badly through the Supreme Court. And I do think it makes it more likely that the Supreme Court will strike down Trump's ability to use IEEPA when they eventually hear that case. But that's not for several months still. And so at this point, the fact that Trump may not have the authority has not yet been challenged effectively in the courts. And the gap between does he have the right and is it enforced is very significant. You can drive a lot of tankers through that. So that's the narrow answer. The broad answer is I'm not sure that I consider most members of the House and Senate to be, sort of internationalists who really understand and care all that much about the global environment. Certainly more, you'll find much more of that in the Senate than you will in the House. But what we've experienced has been an awful lot of people that feel like they don't have capacity to move the needle. That even if they'll say one thing to you privately, they'll say something very different publicly because they're going to be punished for it. And there was a little bit of that under Biden and the Democrats, between the progressive and the centrist wings. There's a lot more of that with Trump, given the fact that if you're not MAGA, they will primary you. And it's become much more consolidated in control under Trump himself, much more so than in his first term, because privately, a lot of Republican House members and senators will tell you they're very worried about the damage the U.S. is doing to its fiscal position long term, the damage the Americans are doing to its soft power, to the ability to attract the world's best students, the world's best workers, the damage it's doing to its own institutions, to the belief in science, USAID shutting it down, impact on the global South, the ability and willingness of the intelligence professionals inside the U.S. to, provide unvarnished analysis that goes to the president. I mean, I was in Washington this week on Tuesday and Wednesday, and I probably met with 6 or 7 senators, and I heard a lot of that, but they're not saying it publicly. So I think that is a problem, and I think, it's a reflection of the United States and its political system becoming incredibly short-term. It's always a problem politically, but has become much more so, much sharper as the consequences become more significant.
Can you unpack for our non-North American viewers the Canada thing? What is going on? Why is Trump apparently so fixated on Canada and willing to be so apparently punitive to Canada?
I think it's changed. I think he was much more focused on Canada when Trudeau was premier, because he really dislikes Trudeau personally. And of course, Trudeau made his trek right down to Mar-a-Lago, and that went very badly. It wasn't well handled. And Trump was leaning into this whole 51st state nonsense, and it is nonsense. It was nonsense. He's given it up. He said, I'm not talking about it anymore a few weeks ago, and, glad to hear it, but very late. And, he also, and that was seen as a hit to Canada's sovereignty. It changed the trajectory of the election. Pierre Poilievre, who was leading the Conservative Party, would have won. And instead, Trudeau, of course, resigned, lack of popularity. His deputy, Chrystia Freeland, the equivalent of Biden stepping aside and Kamala Harris coming up, she was destroyed in their hustings, an internal party vote. And Mark Carney, your former central bank governor, became premier. And that never would have happened. Never would have happened without Trump. Since Carney has become premier, I would hit back against the idea that Canada's been singled out by the United States. I think if there's a surprise, it's that Canada's been treated quite similarly as other countries around the world who aren't remotely as important or close or trusted to the United States by the United States. And that, I think, says a lot, that Trump doesn't think you get anything by virtue of having long-standing relations, being a trusted ally, having shared values and standards. Trump rejects the notion that that is important for a consideration for policy. Trump's view is it should be the law of the jungle. We've been taken advantage of by a lot of countries around the world. We're the most powerful, and we should stop doing that. Now, and of course, as I'm sure you know, James, there's more than a grain of truth in that. I mean, I believe the Americans have benefited wildly from playing a leadership role on the global stage. But I also recognize that the Europeans have underinvested in themselves for 35 years now. And the big thing that has happened over the last generation has not been China's rise at the expense of the United States. Not at all. It's been China's rise at the expense of American allies. And the United States has become asymmetrically far more powerful than its allies. And therefore, it has gotten far less out of its relationship with its allies. And where I disagree with Trump, and I think this is so important for the Europeans to hear, is that America shouldn't want to ground its allies into the dirt. America should want its allies to become more competitive, to become stronger on the global stage, to be able to offer more. Once again, it's not okay, for, Europe's per capita income to be lower than Mississippi. It's not okay. It's not okay to have none of the best entrepreneurs or the unicorn AI companies. It's not okay to have militaries that are completely unfit. Europe needs all of those so that America's alliances can be stronger, right? And unfortunately, Trump doesn't agree with that. Trump wants a weaker, more divided Europe, even though he wants the Europeans to spend more. I think a much stronger, more robust, more competitive Europe is better for the United States and is clearly better for the world.
So I entirely agree with your analysis, and in fact, I don't think I put it quite as eloquently as you, but it's a point I've made both during my time in office as a British minister and subsequently just as a friend of many American lawmakers, that the United States wants the rest of the West to come with it. The United States wants to remain the leader of the Western bloc, because if the United States doesn't take that role, then there's every chance that when you hear people like Macron making really good cases for a sort of tripolar, multipolar world within which the European bloc is a power base in its own right and not always aligned with the US interest. It might seek to kind of calibrate between the US and the Chinese relationship. And I don't think that is in the US's long-term strategic interest. So I absolutely share your view there. But I do think, I've heard people this week say that who are no friend of Trump, to be fair, but people saying that they thought Rutte got it wrong with calling Trump daddy, that was a sort of, that was just too much. I think that, or my take is, you're more of a scholar of him than I am, but the measure of the man is that he needs to hear that sort of language to keep him interested, to keep him friendly, and therefore Rutte did the right thing at the NATO summit. Do you agree?
Not completely. I think that Rutte, I like Mark personally. I knew him quite well when he was prime minister in the Netherlands and advised him a bunch informally. But I think that Trump, number one, I think Trump doesn't actually respect people who kiss quite that much ass. And I think that you can, a better way of playing Trump is in being deferential and showing respect. And yes, absolutely praise him when he's getting it right, but also standing up for the things that really matter to you. I think that, for example, Claudia Sheinbaum has done a much better job with Trump in that regard, and he has more respect for her. I think Mark Carney has done a better job. I think MBS has done a better job. So again, there are other examples, right? And like when Mark Zuckerberg, goes full on obsequious. He actually, Trump laughs about, Zuckerberg privately, and I think he does the same with Rutte, which is why he decided to share those texts, because they were so overbearing. And I think they do, look, I think Rutte he took one for the team. The summit went well. It's much better that Rutte does that, who's in a position that doesn't really matter, than the president of France or the premier of the UK. Fair enough. But I do think that on the margins, and we'll all forget about this at some point, that Rutte did some damage to the legitimacy of being Secretary General in NATO that he didn't have to do. And look, those texts were not intended to be made public, but in Mark's position, and he is again no novice to what intelligence is like. If you're writing a text, you expect that it will be made public at some point. And he wasn't careful. He wasn't careful, in my view.
I am conscious of your time. We've only got 6 or 7 minutes left, and I want to just touch on two things, if I may. Firstly, that after you and I, the third most important person visiting DC this week was Bibi Netanyahu, and it would be good to get your thoughts on what he went home with, and then finally, I'm intrigued to get your thoughts on what happened over the Ukrainian military aid. I'm hearing that Bridge Colby is all powerful in the DoD and is running policy. But look, let's get your thoughts on that. Netanyahu and Iran, and then the US position on Ukraine.
Netanyahu, Iran, the Americans, and the Israelis are now in reasonable agreement that the Iranian nuclear program has been set back at least 2 years by the damage that's been done. I'm glad that those assessments are becoming, sort of more reasonable and more public, and that's pretty significant. Americans are much more interested in engaging in negotiations at this point. Both countries are in a much stronger position than Iran. Iran was not able to do anything of meaning in response to the American attacks. This looks like a big win for Trump. Having now done that, Bibi and his Likud party are much more popular inside Israel. If Israel wanted to move forward with peace in Gaza, he could lose his far-right coalition partners, call a snap election, and there's a pretty good chance he'd be able to win with new coalition partners. And that's what's required if you want peace in Gaza. That's what required if you want Palestinians to have some level of autonomy, statehood or otherwise. That's what's required if you want the Saudis to join the Abraham Accords. As of this week, we're still pretty far from that. We could get a ceasefire, a short-term ceasefire. The sides are close there. The Trump folks, privately I'm talking to, are still blaming largely Hamas for that, not the Israelis. But they think significant progress has been made, and that's why the Qataris came through and all of that. So that's where we are on Netanyahu. And the Nobel Peace Prize stuff is all just stupid. Plus Pakistan got there first. On defense, you're right. I mean, Bridge Colby is in charge of policy at defense. He's certainly much more capable than the secretary is. And he has been trying to ensure that the United States has enough capacity for itself before it is providing for others, for allies. And he's also kind of playing the role that, sort of Bessent and Lutnick have on the economic side, which is, we're going to push countries harder on deals. And that has, first meant a review of AUKUS, which the Australians are already starting to pay for, these submarines. The Australians are very upset about this. And also it led to this suspension with Ukraine. But here, Trump, when he met with Zelensky, was not aware of it back in The Hague a couple weeks ago, and he intervened. And he wants to make sure that the Ukrainians do get this military support and are having more weapons being sold to them, which the Europeans are prepared to spend more money on. And I think, frankly, that Trump has moved more on Russia than he has on any other foreign policy issue over the last 6 months. He thought that Putin was prepared to give him a deal. He was wrong. He offered a lot. Including squeezing the Ukrainians pretty hard, but offered a lot in terms of reduction of sanctions and the rest, and Putin gave him nothing. Trump is embarrassed by that. He's angry by that. He is not in Putin's pocket. That's lazy analysis that annoys me. And he's now preparing not just to provide more support for the Ukrainians, but also thinking about what additional sanctions against Russia might look like. And that, of course, puts the Europeans in a very different position than the panic that they were facing back when I was in Munich in February and Vice President J.D. Vance was telling the Europeans, no, you guys are the principal adversaries. We're in a very different position here in July, and I'm glad to see it. So learning, it turns out that Trump can actually learn, right? I mean, he'll never admit that he was wrong about anything, but the reality is he was wrong about this.
Yeah, and it's and to his credit, he appears to be grasping that and now doing the right thing. I think everybody could see that Putin was playing him, but someone who is passionately supportive of the Ukrainian cause, I'm very grateful to see that he's now changing his position. Just very quickly, that AUKUS review, if you had to place your bets on the AUKUS submarines happening with American yard capacity being taken up as a consequence, would you bet on it happening or not?
Yeah, I think it'll happen, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are some delays.
Yeah. I fear that is true, which is a great shame. I thought that the AUKUS deal is one of the main big strategic things the last few years, but I understand the America First imperative.
I am told, I don't know if this is public yet, but what the hell, I'll say it to you, that there's going to be a big bipartisan Senate delegation going to Australia in the summer, and I think that will help. There's a lot of effort to make sure that this relationship, this critical security relationship, which also the Americans run a surplus on trade with the Australians, that it remains strong and solid and that we don't take them for granted. I think that there's going to be more focus on that.
Ian, fascinating. Thank you. You've been watching Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. For more of Times Radio's brilliant geopolitical content, please like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. But for now, Ian Bremmer, thank you very, very much in joining us. See you next week.